First thing I want to say is, as expected, as I expected in any case, the participants in this discussion had as much to offer as those of us who were supposed to be the panelists. And I want to thank all of you for that. Also wanted to say that it may not be obvious, and I want it to be clear, that I'm African American. I'm a very light complexioned African American who has lived through the struggle for racial justice in a very peculiar spot. That peculiar spot resulted in my standing in the living room of a college friend who invited me to his home in the suburbs, waiting for his father to come down to greet us. And when he did come down, he was in a great hurry. And he finally said to us, you're welcome. You're welcome in our house. But I just have to tell you that I just finished the greatest book I've ever read. And it proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that apes are superior to Negroes. When I heard that, I expected that perhaps my roommate would say something. He didn't. I thought, should I say something? And I didn't. And one of the values of the moments we're living through now is that those of us who may have kept their mouths shut at other periods in their life are more likely today to open up and say, what in the world are you talking about? I documented the struggles in this book, which you can find in the Weiser Library. So drop down there and get it. It's also available on Amazon. It's called Light, Bright, Damn Near White. And that's, effectively speaking, the experience I've had in interracial justice. Second thing I want to tell you is, it is a damned long road to emancipation. You might have heard that Juneteenth was celebrated recently with sort of renewed zest. And I, for one, am deeply grateful for that. I wish it had happened 50 years sooner. I grew up and knew nothing about Juneteenth. And I don't know how many of you did also, but it is a story in an opening chapter of why it's such a long, long road to emancipation. It was not important enough for the folks who made the decision about slavery to ensure that the folks who were affected by the decision, by the legislation, by the proclamation, sorry, knew about it. And it was subsequently followed by legislation that permitted slaveholders to reclaim their slaves. And many, many blacks, my father included, ended up in Canada, hoping that there they would find a true escape from the threat of slavery. I cannot tell you how enormously difficult it is to believe that this country, which I grew up believing, well, for instance, in, I think it was 52, Eisenhower was president. There was a charge from the Russians that we had a spy plane. They shot the sucker down. And we denied that it was ours. I believed it wasn't ours. I believed we didn't spy, that we were a good country. We didn't need to spy. Why in the world would we? Just the taste of that in the history of each of us. And there is some of that in the history of all of us, that we're good people. We should lead the nation. We have a democracy and we celebrate freedom. Well, slowly but surely, we are learning the hell we do. We are a military nation, and we fight whenever we get good and ready to protect what it is we think is required to defend our freedom, while inside, we do nothing whatsoever to protect and serve the citizens we supposedly are committed to protecting and serving, specifically the Black citizens. My brothers, my five oldest brothers, all served in the Second World War. All of them came home. Their complaints were identical. Why in the world would U.S. GIs treat German prisoners of war better than they treated their fellow GIs, their Black GIs? I can't imagine. How in the world do you ask me to go to war, fight for this country, and then the soldiers who are supposed to be colleagues treat me like I'm a piece of crap? That's the part of our history that has been altogether obliterated. We are slowly but surely recovering it. We have a hell of a long way to go before the recovery is complete. Now I'm putting on my cap. Yep, there it is. It says Selma, 50th. I went to Selma in 1965. And I marched in 1965. I was scared to death. Not quite to death, I'm still alive. I was scared. Students from Chicago State, where I was then working, went along with me. And their comment, as we hear from students today so often, is, Rev, talking to me, we got to go to Selma. And there was no debate about that. It was just a question of how we were going to do it. I loaded up the Volkswagen bus, and 4 or 5 students and I headed out to Selma. We got there and obviously found ourselves in hostile territory. But after Selma, we came back to Chicago, and those of you who mourn the death of George Floyd today need to know that in 1968, we mourned the death of a guy who was a sparring partner of Joe Lewis's, who was shot on the streets of Chicago by a police officer, a white police officer, trying to give him a parking ticket. His 6-year-old son was in the vehicle with him. We marched, we picketed, we cried out in demonstrations at City Council in Chicago. Nobody paid one bit of attention. And lest you think that I'm pointing my finger at whites, I'm not. Because the Black community had come to assume that, well, what more would you expect? And so we're not motivated at all to do anything. 55 years later, please don't check my math, I find myself in a rally that my granddaughter has helped to organize in Santee. And she's asked me to come and be a speaker. And I agreed to go. And I expected, in my experience with marches and protests, if you could get 100 people together and get them on the street, you had yourself a major victory. Well, if there were 100 people there, there were 2,000 people there. I had a megaphone. I don't know if 25 people heard me or not, but it was a powerful, joyous celebration of the commitments of a whole new constituency to it's now time, right now, it's time. We see some significant changes in police practices. Those changes in San Diego included the chokehold. Now the mayor says he no longer favors the chokehold. The police chief says he no longer favors the chokehold. The police in San Diego, not one single solitary police officer has been even formally suspended because of an overuse of force for killing a citizen. Not one. Well, it's because there is a police review board that had no power, could not call witnesses, had no authority whatsoever, and they got their information on what happened in the incident from the police. That now is going to change. It has not changed yet, so we've got to keep our eyes open. And while I'm at it, the most significant lesson from my experience is, if you think that democracy and justice will survive while you sit home sleeping, you are wrong. If you are not ready and willing to get on your feet and watch what's going on in your community, and if you're not willing to set a standard of what you really require, the hell with what the administration's saying is necessary or is right. What do you think is necessary and right? And are you prepared to stand up and battle for it? To be unpopular? Right now, it isn't even hard to stand up. Every time you turn around, you run into another protest march by Black Lives Matter. So all you have to do is just be willing to join the parade. But they won't always be that easy, and they won't always be that welcoming. But you have an opportunity right now to get on your feet and let your feet talk for you about how committed you are to social justice. I want to say one other thing, which I didn't say. Dr. King said it, and in my mind, they are the most important words ever spoken by anybody at any time. Dr. King said, we have to get this right. Power without love is reckless and abusive. Love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands for justice. And justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. I'm done.
Richard, do you want to talk about that photo? You'll see the one in the black and white one here.
I know which one you're
But I know,
talking
but I'm telling others the black and white one.
Yes, thank you. You know, I said earlier, I went to Selma in '65 and I marched with Dr. King, and Dr. King came to Chicago later and led a series of very, very violent open housing marches, and decided, because the violence was so vicious, that he'd moved to Chicago working on open housing. And I, at that time, was leading a neighborhood organization called the Englewood Action Committee. And we were fighting an urban renewal project that planned to use federal funds to demolish 600 plus quality homes recently purchased by Black families who, by the way, at that time couldn't get a mortgage. So they had to purchase this on a land contract from the owner. These 600 homes were to be torn down to create an access road to the parking lot that they wanted to build around the shopping center at 63rd and Halsted Street on the south side of Chicago. There's a Sears there and a Woolworths and I don't remember what all, and Chicago City Bank and Trust. And so the ministers in the community joined in one day and we went to Chicago City Bank and Trust, and just before we were ready to leave the church for to get to the bank, Dr. King's associate called and said, Dr. King wants to join the march. Well, I don't know how to describe the absolute delight and joy that filled that room as we waited for Dr. King to arrive. Well, he did join us, and we marched on Chicago City Bank, and we withdrew our money. And after that, one of Dr. King's staff said to him, well, why don't you burn the bank book? There was a photographer from the Chicago Black Defender, the Chicago Defender, the black paper in Chicago. He took the picture that you're looking at as Dr. King and I held these up in protest for what not only was an incredible distortion of the purposes of urban renewal, but in addition, that bank happened to also be violating anybody's sense of fairness by having very, very few Black employees. And at the time, actually, there was one Black employee, and he was the janitor.
Thanks, Richard.
If I had my way, police officers would be taken out of uniform. You know, I realize that part of that is an intent to be sure that a police officer is recognized when they're carrying out official business. But I think they need to find a better way to do it. And connected with that is the fact that so many police officers, and I wish I knew the numbers, but I don't, have previous military history. In the military, in case you haven't noticed, you're trained to kill. And in the military, you're trained to follow orders. And when a police officer who's ex-military sees a citizen on the street and the police officer gives an order, that police officer thinks, we have the responsibility to follow it. No questions asked. And the police officer is wrong. The police officer's only responsibility is to assure that if there's been an offense and they think there's been an offense, they need to hold that offender until a judge and a jury gets an opportunity to hear whether or not that individual is guilty of any wrong. How many police officers approach their job in that way? I don't think very many.
And I think that's why we have to get back to community policing or start re-educating them. Like, I think police officers need to get out on the street and walk the beat. We need to know who they are. They need to know who we are.
Absolutely.
We need to have a relationship with them. So if you are on the street and you say Dan and Bob have a conflict and the officer knows Dan and Bob, then he can be a peace officer and handle that conflict. But if you're rolling around in your car and you live in Walnut Creek, but you're over here policing in East Oakland, you don't even want to get out. You don't even want to know the people that you're policing. So when you do get out, you get out with guns blasting. That's the way our police is set up. It's set up like they are at war with the people they are supposed to be serving. And that's what we have to change.
Amen. I think there's nothing better to stimulate a movement than a stupid enemy. Enemies who do stupid things.
Every day.
And we've had a guy in the White House who's filled that role pretty well. But in the civil rights movement, it's the same story. If we find ourselves thinking that we are in the presence of guys who are okay, they're trying to make life livable for us all, and it's not likely we're going to do much protesting. It's not likely that we're going to see much social change. You know, we work to change things that hurt us. We don't work to change things with which we're comfortable. And so as far as I'm concerned, the transition, of course the transition matters. If Trump gets in another year, I don't know what I'm going to do. I honestly don't know. But we'll survive.